I'm Justin Gordon for Tender Touch Counseling Services, and this is Addiction, Body, Mind, and Brain. The first thing we have to understand about addiction is a progressive illness. If left unchecked, it can lead to the deterioration of your social life, mental health, and eventually your body. So let's talk about some myths versus truths in addiction. The first thing we have to understand is that addiction is hereditary. So if you have a parent or even a grandparent, sometimes an aunt or an uncle, that suffers from alcoholism, from drug addiction, those things can find their way down into from your family tree to you. It makes you more likely to suffer from those illnesses. Do support groups such as AA or NA really help? Well, research finds that yes, actually they do, but it's not just AA or NA that helps. People that belong to churches, people that belong to really any type of support group increases the likelihood for someone to maintain their sobriety for longer periods of time. Even people that are recently leaving prison, I've had long periods of really difficult times, do much better with support systems to help them. Who is most likely to succumb to addiction? Can we stop whenever we want? So, who is most likely to succumb to addiction? Anybody is really able to succumb to addiction. It does not discriminate between age, between race, between economic status. I've seen people from every sorts of job come in for help with addiction. It does not matter where they are from or who they are. Be anybody. Are we able to stop whenever we want? It is a difficult question. I get asked that question a lot. I think that with the proper help, people are able to make good decisions. It's not always people's decisions that allow us to become clean and sober. Sometimes we need assistance in the physical as well. For instance, some people that have been drinking for a very, very long time at a very high and heavy rate may become physically addicted to alcohol, and if they suddenly stop drinking, they will go through DTs, have seizures. What exactly is happening to the brain when we are using drugs? Well, for a lot of drugs, what's happening is that the pleasure center of the brain is being hijacked. So things that used to give us pleasure, not so much anymore. Now it's mostly just about the drinking or the drugs. Those are the main priorities. Those are the things that make us happy. Whereas things even like family, old hobbies that used to make us happy, don't give us that same sense of happiness or pleasure anymore. Is there a cure? Unfortunately, we do not have a cure-all for addiction. We have treatments, but unfortunately those treatments also vary depending on the person. Not everybody's body is the same, not everybody's brain is the same, and not everybody's been through the same life, not everybody's been through the same trauma. So the treatment for addiction will always be different for each person, and it will not always be the same medication, it will not always be the same support groups. So we need to keep that in mind. We need to remember that addiction is in the mind, in the brain, and the body, and this is an important distinction to make, because the brain is where the chemical interactions are going on when we use alcohol or drugs. The mind is all of our ideas about things, our ideas about who we are, our ideas about what the world is, even what the very things we're putting into our body, the drugs and alcohol putting into our body, what they are. Of course, the body, you have interactions going on physically as well. So we also have to remember that everyone has habits, right? And habits are not addictions, but it is important to realize that a habit can turn into an addiction. So one of the things that I always ask people is, how do you brush your teeth? How do you put on your shoes? Do you do that the same way every day? Probably, most people do. When do you go to sleep? When do you eat? These are all habits. We don't consider them addictions until they become detrimental to your health. But it is important to ask yourself, how hard would it be just to change these habits? So these aren't even addictions, but how hard would it be to sit there and think about, well, instead of brushing my my teeth over on this side. I'm going to brush them on this side today, and then I'm going to go to this side. I'm going to put my left shoe on instead of my right shoe on first. So even those things, we don't think about them, but it's hard to even just change those things. So changing an addiction is sometimes feels like it is moving a mountain. It's easier to replace habits and easier to replace addictions by adding a new habit or a new addiction instead of stopping them cold turkey. So for instance, I smoke 2.5 packs a day of unfiltered cigarettes. And when I quit, I did not try and quit cold turkey because I felt like that was too difficult and I had already tried 4 or 5 times. So what I did do is I started chewing gum instead, and I chewed a lot of gum. But that replaced part of the desire to smoke the cigarettes. So if you can replace the detrimental addiction with a smaller, less detrimental habit, you're on your way to doing a little bit better. And that can help you to quit the addiction entirely. This is not always the case, so keep an eye on it. So some habits, while not healthy, are better than others. For instance, it's not recommended that you quit using nicotine at the same time as you're quitting other drugs or addictions. So you don't want to say, well, I'm going to quit cigarettes, I'm going to quit alcohol, I'm going to quit doing drugs, I want to go on a diet, and I want to go start running, and whoa, come on, that's too much stuff, though. So you want to choose one of those, one at a time. Give yourself some credit, give yourself a little pass there, because you don't want to put too much on yourself. So forming habits, forming addictions as well. Your brain is constantly changing its shape based on the habits and decisions that you make. So most people don't really realize this, but your brain is actually always moving around. It's kind of got like tendrils moving around. Synapses connect ideas to other ideas. So if you always smoke a cigarette after eating, those two ideas will slowly connect. There are two tendrils, two synapses in your brain that will connect, make that a reality. And for most things, that's fine. Shoes go on feet. Shoes, feet. All right, that's fine. The problem is when you have an addiction and that happens, those two synapses come together. To break them apart is very, very difficult. So let's go back to the smoking after dinner part. I want to break that habit. That means I have to go several nights without smoking after dinner before those two things slowly move apart. And it will probably take months and months of training my brain not to recognize those things before they move apart. And the really big problem here is if I smoke after dinner one time, guess what? It's going to follow that scar tissue all the way back and they're going to touch again. So unfortunately, if you slip up even once on a habit or a addiction, for many instances, it is like you went back to step one. And that is really frustrating for people, physically anyway, who have experienced that. Now, there are other ways your life can have changed so that you don't go back to step one, and you can immediately decide to make other changes, but physically your body may feel like you've gone back, and that is really frustrating. We have naturally occurring receptors in our brain for some drugs, and the reason for this is that some drugs are chemically almost identical to things that are already in our brain. So we have, for example, dopamine, which is responsible for a lot of different things in your brain, very important chemical. It is chemically very similar to cocaine. That's why frequently people that use cocaine get a very up feeling, or it's one of the reasons they get a very up feeling, because your brain cannot distinguish between cocaine and dopamine. Even though chemically we can see that they are slightly different to our brain, they look similar enough that it just says, come on in. So addiction can change the brain, as we talked about before. More accurately, addiction hijacks the brain's reward system. And this can be extremely bad because things that used to make you happy no longer make you happy if you used or drank enough. And this happens not just with drugs. This happens with anything that we could consider an addiction. So people can be addicted to lots of different things, even things that you would not think of. People can be addicted to sex and gambling. Obviously, those are two of the other big ones besides drugs and alcohol that people talk about. People can be addicted to bad situations and pain. People can be addicted to all sorts of things. that will take away from their enjoyment of regular everyday activities. So we want to ask, what feels good? What makes us happy? We want to, if it's healthy, keep those things going. If we start to lose track of those, we might want to consider ways of getting them back. Because technically, it's the chemicals in our brain that make us feel good. So if we can attach a good feeling to a good situation, that's almost the opposite of addiction, right? That's good, right? So if I want to say, well, I feel good when I pet my dog, then if I start to feel a little down, a little depressed, it's okay to pet my dog. It might make me feel a little bit better. Nothing wrong with that. The other thing to remember is that the brain desires repetition. This is something from when we were kind of hunter-gatherers a long time ago. When we learned the same patterns of behavior of the animals, our brains rewarded us because, hey, now we know where to get them. We know where to either avoid them or hunt them for food. We know where the bushes are going to be, when they're going to be. Our brain rewards us because we need to know that. So now you might find that hearing the same song on the radio, you don't remember any of the words to the song, but you remember the chorus. And when the chorus comes on, you know those words. That's the repetition. And your brain rewards you for knowing those words. But you don't remember the rest of the song. Well, unfortunately, that's nature. But this can be both detrimental and healthy for us in situations when it comes to addiction. So when we repeat the same patterns over and over again, we want to sometimes be able to break those patterns, but our brain may be rewarding us for doing the same patterns over and over again, even if they're bad, even if they're unhealthy. Our brain says, oh yeah, well, I know that today we're going to go smoke a cigarette. I know today we're going to go drink or use drugs. Today we're going to go see this person that we know is bad for us. Our brain may reward us for that, even though it's a bad thing. And we also have to remember that we start forming these patterns and sort of repetitive behaviors at a very early age. It's part of our survival instincts. We need to learn what is going to be helpful for us, what is going to be good for us, what is going to be beneficial to us. So some of these habits we learn very early on, but then we try to break them when we're adults, and it's much harder because we've already learned the patterns. This is where we get into abusive relationships and things like that. So the developed brain has a lot of different sections here. We have movement and sensation up here. We have judgment. We have reward and memory. We have pain, vision, coordination, distributed throughout the brain. Roughly, we think this is where these areas are that have to do with the different aspects of our brain and our life. And different drugs affect different parts of our brain. So some of these drugs, including alcohol, can affect or damage these specific parts of our brain that have to do with a specific thing. Right. So different addictions affect different parts of the brain. Some drugs, as we talked about, are chemically almost identical to what is already in our brain. So serotonin and MDMA or ecstasy, very similar to each other. And as I said, dopamine and cocaine, very similar to each other. Unfortunately, our brain welcomes those things in because it thinks that they are things that are already existing there. Introduction of some chemicals can result in unanticipated results. Like I said, everybody's brain chemistry is just a little bit different. Everybody's body chemistry is just a little bit different. Also, we don't really know how the drugs that we're already taking, prescription or otherwise, will interact with the drugs that we are now putting into our body. Oftentimes, people are unaware of the half-life of the drugs they're taking, how long they're in their body for. A good example of this is chapstick, something very simple and easy to use. You'd think it was innocuous, you'd think it was not dangerous, and it's not dangerous exactly, but if I overuse chapstick, if I put it on several times a day for several days in a row, one of the things that happens is that my body stops producing oil for my lips because it says, hey, you're already taking care of your lips, you're already fixing them and putting stuff on them. I don't need to do that. And you will stop getting the oil from your lips. Now this is after a lot of overuse of chapstick, so quite a bit. But this happens also to your brain. So people that use ecstasy very, very, very often, this has to do quite a bit of ecstasy use, MDMA use, Molly, you stop getting serotonin produced in your brain. Serotonin is responsible for your happiness. A lot of people that are depressed may know serotonin reuptake inhibitors as antidepressants. If you're not getting any serotonin in your brain, if your brain's not producing any serotonin, you're going to get really depressed. You're going to get extremely depressed. And there have been some cases where people have so little serotonin in their brain after overusing MDMA or ecstasy that they need to permanently have medications every day in order to just be happy, because their brain will not produce the serotonin. Their brain will not make them happy, even when they should be happy. All right, so as I said, dopamine and cocaine, very similar. If you see dopamine and cocaine next to each other, you can probably differentiate between those two things. You'd say, oh, well, that looks a little bit different. They don't look quite the same, but your brain can't tell the difference. Unfortunately, that causes a lot of problems. As we talked about with the ecstasy and the serotonin, some similar stuff happens to the dopamine and the cocaine. If you use cocaine long enough, and every day, all day, you're going to have some permanent brain damage. And the reason we say that it is brain damage is that any long-lasting change to your brain due to an outside force can be categorized as brain damage. These changes can be permanent and last for a long period of time, or just a few days, just one day. There's no way to know. But they can also cause long-lasting mood changes, and we certainly don't want that. So remember we talked about how your brain functions. We had the different parts of your brain. I want to talk about cocaine. So cocaine affects kind of the middle part of your brain where the pain area was, kind of where the reward was as well. This is important because that's where it's focused. That's where most of it is focused. Now, the cocaine does kind of get to other parts of your brain, but as we understand, that's where it was focused. Opiates in your brain. This is important because opiates affect a large portion of your brain, a larger portion of your brain than the cocaine did. So it affects the same parts as the cocaine, but also affects some of the vision, some of the movement, some of the sensation. So you can kind of see that with people that abuse opiates. They get kind of lethargic, get a little bit confused. And we look at THC in your brain. Now this is an interesting one because people always ask me, they say, Justin, is THC dangerous? Is marijuana dangerous? THC is one of the active ingredients in marijuana. And I tell them that while THC isn't necessarily dangerous the way other drugs is, it's not going to permanently damage your brain or anything like that. It is so pervasive throughout your brain when you use it, especially with the new forms of marijuana, the new THC that's out there, the availability of it, that it kind of dampens things. So your brain communicates with itself. The different parts of your brain communicate with kind of like thunderstorms that are going on in your brain all the time. These electric impulses. Now think of the THC as plastic wrap that goes around each of your brain cells mostly when you use too much, when you use a lot. If your brain cells are shrink wrapped in plastic, we know that electricity doesn't really go through plastic as well as some other things. While you'll still get the messages in your brain, the messages to move, the messages to talk, messages to do what you need to do, they may be a little slow in getting where they need to go. And we see this in people that have used too much marijuana or use too strong a dose of marijuana. For them, they get a little confused, a little lethargic. So I'm going to move on into the SPECT scan portion of this presentation. So I want to talk about SPECT scan is a type of nuclear imaging test. It's a radioactive substance that they use to image people's brains. It's used to image for dementia, clogged blood vessels, seizures, epilepsy, and head injuries, other brain disorders. So we're going to look at SPECT scans of brains that have suffered from drug use for various periods of time from various substances. All right, so this is a SPECT scan of a normal brain on the left, quote unquote normal brain. I don't like to think of anybody as normal or abnormal. We just are the way we are. Versus 12 years of constant marijuana use. So it looks like there is damage to the brain. There actually is not damage to the brain. This is the parts of the brain on the right that are lighting up. So you're not seeing the parts of the brain that are not lighting up. And that just means that they are dormant for now. They're not active. Remember, we don't use 100% of our brain 100% of the time. So it doesn't mean that this person is severely damaged or dying. This is a normal brain that is not using drugs versus someone that has used 25 years of constant alcohol use. So the bright colors, the yellow, the red, that's the very active part. On the brain on the right, you don't really see a whole lot of red and yellow. There's a little bit of yellow down there. That's kind of there might be some damage with constant alcohol use. It's a little different than the THC. Hopefully we're not seeing any damage, but it could be there. This is 2 years of constant cocaine use. So this is more specific. So the alcohol damage or alcohol dormancy was all over the place. This is, you can see, very specific quote-unquote holes. Those aren't actually holes, those are just the inactive parts of the brain. You can see how it differs around the edges as well from the normal brain. So this is a brain with 20 years of heroin use. This is kind of the scariest one, right? Just kind of pieces that are just sort of dormant all over the place. It looks like they're damaged. They may be damaged. We don't know. Heroin is obviously a scary drug at times. Hopefully it's better, and it does. Okay, so this is a brain on the left that has used, and on the right is the same brain that has 1 year of sobriety. Now, we don't talk about exactly what this brain has been through, how long it's been through it, but the real takeaway is that after 6 months to a year of sobriety, most brains we have found seem to heal. There's been a lot of studies on this. This is not just a little hopeful grab I'm giving you. We find that if you can manage to stop the addiction, stop the usage from the addiction, and remain sober for 6 months to a year, a lot of the damage to the brain does reverse itself. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free. I would love to hear them. And it has been great